8. When we opened the door to our guest room on the third floor of the West Wing, intent on changing clothes before we visited Kismel's chambers, both Asen and I exclaimed with surprise. The slender elf knight was already sitting on the sofa in our room. "What are you doing here, Kismel?" Asana asked, trotting over to her. The knight lifted a narrow glass in her hand. "I was waiting for you, of course. Have you finished talking with the new visitors?" "Huh? You knew they were meeting with other human warriors?" I asked, which brought a little curl of smile to her lips. "But of course, I keep my distance, not wanting to interfere." "You wouldn't have been a bother at all." Despite my reassurance, however, it indeed is a good thing for us that Kismel had been considerate. Kismel was far more human in her mannerisms and intelligence than other dark elves, and certainly more than a generic dark elf scout accompanying Kwasak. I couldn't imagine how they might react to her, and it wasn't clear what effect it would have on her to interact with players who might speak openly by the fact this world was just a VR game. In online RPGs I played before SAO, I was not good at actual role playing, but somehow it had become natural for me to assume the role of human swordsman traveling across Aincrad when interacting with dark elves, a development that filled me with mild wonder. Kismel waved at us to sit. "Did you finish speaking with the new visitors?" "Yes, they said they were going to visit with the master of the castle," Asana explained. The knight placed a new glass before her and poured a pale golden liquid from the bottle on the table. When she did the same for me, I noticed a refreshing familiar scent wafting up. It must have been that moon-tier wine that her sister till now loved. We shared a toast, and I took a sip of a rather strong alcohol that couldn't actually get you drunk, before saying, "I think those four will be leaving the castle in the morning to go to the shrine in the south, so we won't see them until the evening. It's your valuable day off tomorrow, so we should find our own useful task to..." Softly and suddenly, Asana jabbed at me with her elbow. I looked at her with bewilderment before I realized what I'd just done. The 4 members of Kwasak were going south tomorrow to retrieve the agate key from the shrine, the same key that we just brought back today. The set of 6 hidden keys that would open the mysterious sanctuary device, which the dark elf legend held would destroy Aincrad, and which the forest elves believed would return it to the earth, would not exist in duplicate. As far as Kismel knew, we had gone from the 3rd to the 6th floor through a great trials and had managed to collect 4 of these precious one-of-a-kind keys. But within the game systems, there were as many secret keys as there were players undertaking the Elf War questline. At this moment, Kwasak was receiving a quest from Count Galleon to recover the agate key. What if they left tomorrow and returned after finishing the quest, and Kismel witnessed them carrying a new copy of the key? It could very well happen. What if she asked us why the 4 of them were going to that very same shrine? If NPCs in this game had such advanced AI, shouldn't they be programmed with the ability to integrate that information and take it all in stride? "I see. It is much to ask of you humans, I know," Kismel murmured. She drank down the last of her wine. I picked up the bottle automatically and reached to pour her a glass. Another, then cautiously asked, "Do you know the reason they're going to the shrine, Kismel?" "To retrieve the hidden key, of course." Austin and I stared at the dark elf, who seemed unbothered by the knowledge. When she noticed us staring, she looked a bit curious and then smiled. "Ah, so you did not know then?" Didn't know what?" Asana asked quietly. Kismel smiled and turned a bit apologetic. "The commanding officer of the Vanguard force explained that he was using knights to confuse and mislead the forest elves, did he not? We are arranging a similar thing for the duty of retrieving the keys." "What does that mean?" "Even after we recovered the key from the shrine, other knights and scouts have been headed to the same shrines, carrying false keys mocked up by our priestesses to our camps and fortresses. If any human pledge assistance along the way, we accept it. This is all to mislead the forest elves, remember. Asa and I had no words. The existence of fake keys itself was a surprise. But even more than that, wouldn't that expose those decoy knights and soldiers to danger? I asked, stunned. Gizmo looked down. That is correct. More than a few knights have been attacked by the forest elves, and I understand some have lost their lives. But why do you need to go through such lengths? Asuna demanded, leaning forward. The knight placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Because that is how serious a duty it is to retrieve a sealed key, and the mentality one needs to undertake the mission. Failure is unacceptable. Now the history and knowledge of the collected people of Lysula, Kelo, humankind, dwarfkind are contained within this floating castle. And, should it collapse, all will be lost, along with many, many lives. We cannot allow ruin to come to the things that the priestesses of yore gave her precious life to protect. I believe that Her Majesty, the Queen, wants the 6 keys so she can keep the sanctuary doors shut forever. Gizmo stopped there, but my mind was half occupied with other things. After Asuna and I intertwined in the battle between Kismel and the forest elves, the forest elven Hollow Knight back on the 3rd floor, the duels between dark and forest elves had continued without end. This was only natural, as it would be an event that entered into the players into the Elf War campaign quest. But if Kismel's explanation was taken at face value, it suggested that the elves undertook even this unavoidable matter of the story's convenience at risk of their own lives. But had the designer of this quest, some writers at Argus, really considered this angle when designing it? It was common sense that in an MMORPG, the same events occurred from each player. Anything less wouldn't be fair. When seen from inside the game world, it would look like the same character was dying and coming back to life over and over, and no player was going to complain about this being illogical. That little girl from my Anil Blade quest, for example, spent an eternity getting sick, being cured, back and forth. Was it really the game's designers who created these secondary elements like fake keys and decoy knights in order to protect the integrity of our worldview and the game mechanics under the hood? Or is it something else, like the world itself? What is it, Kirito? I looked up when I had heard my name and met eyes with Kismel, who had been equally lost in thought. Nothing. Just thinking about some things. I understand how you feel. Sometimes I even wonder if the 4 keys we're carrying around are the real thing or not. For real? I asked. I accidentally slipping into some real-world slang. But that saying had clearly been absorbed into Kismel's vocabulary at this point, and she paid it no mind. Yes, for real. It would have been real because we took it from the shrine. But once it had been placed in the vault or fortress of the castle, there's no telling if the priestesses might have switched it out. Ah, I see. So it's potentially true that both our keys and Kwasak keys are fakes, or maybe the story holds that they're both real. I wondered, once again lost in questions that had no answer. Next to me, Asuna asked, if you're going through the lengths of creating false keys to distract the forest elves, wouldn't it be a bad thing to have the keys, real or fake, collected in the same place? I mean, Yofel Castle got attacked. Yes, there is logic to what you say, agreed Kismel, who looked up at the ceiling. The guest chamber at Yofel Castle had a huge window that afforded a view of the outside, but Castle Galley carved right into the rock, so the windows were only on the hallway side. They compensated with plenty of interior lights, in addition to the wall-hanging lamps that the inns in Statchen and Cerebus had. There was an elaborate candelabra hanging from the ceiling like a chandelier, its little fires flickering. We assumed that Yofel Castle would never be attacked. The forest elves on the 4th floor had only a few small boats, and we couldn't have imagined they would team up with the fallen elves. If you had not warned us, we would not have prepared for the attack in time. Even with Viscount Yofel's power, the castles might have been lost. But Kismel looked back at us and gave a reassuring smile. Even with the wicked cleverness of the fallen, it is impossible for them to attack Castle Galley with a huge army. As you saw for yourselves, I could not take 10 steps outside this place without the Greenleaf Cape. The forest elves will have some kind of similar cloak, but surely only in small numbers. And the cape that was sewn from the leaves of the holy tree, there shall never be another of its kind. Even the boar warriors of the forest elves would not ask to dream of attacking this castle with no more than 10, at risk of losing all treasure handed down since the great separation. What about the fallen elves? Is it possible that they have something similar? Asuna persisted, but Asuna again shook her head. Have you forgotten? The fallen elves were cursed by the holy tree. If they should be put on the cape made of its leaves, they should be burned to ash, or something similar. If not, to such an extreme, the pain and scarring would be intense regardless. Oh, you're right, Asuna said, sticking out her tongue to show how forgetful she was. Kismel chuckled back, but her mirth did not last very long. She folded her arms in a thinking pose. But as Asuna says, keeping the keys in one place for too long is only inviting needless risk, perhaps. There is a spirit tree here at the castle, so I suppose I shall give up on my day's rest, and continue soon as the morning arrives. What? I was going to shout, but Asuna was quicker. No! She practically flew over the low table to Kismel's side and grabbed the knight's hand in her own. I'm sorry that I caused you to worry. I understand now that this castle is safe. Just stay with us tomorrow. I've been thinking about what we would do. Kismel's dark purple eyes blinked several times. Then how many times had I seen this now? Gave the gentle smile of an older girl to her younger sister. All right then. Then I will leave in 2 days, as originally planned. What shall we do tomorrow? It's still a secret. I'll announce it in the morning. So look, forward to the surprise, Asuna said with a grin. I, however, felt a little bit unnerved by that. Minutes later, the slender wine bottle was empty. Kismel slumped against the back of the sofa. Whew. I believe I am a bit intoxicated. I examined her face, but the coffee-brown skin was not any different from usual, and I couldn't anticipate what would happen if an AI got drunk. Asuna looked worried, however, and asked, Are you all right? Can you get back to your room? Ha! I am not so drunk that I cannot stand. But, she said, pausing to look at us in turn, the room I've been given is too large for one person. Do you mind if I sleep on this long couch tonight? What? I yelped out of reflex, but in fact, Asuna and I had no reason to refuse her. I was going to tell her it was perfectly all right, of course, until I realized something. In a situation with 2 women and 1 man, it seemed clear which one of the 3 should take the sofa. In that case, you can sleep in the bedroom with Asuna, Kismel. I'll sleep on the sofa instead. As I drifted off into slumber, I hoped that it was the same way for Asuna and Kismel. The night of January 3rd passed in silence. Or so I thought. A forceful alarm woke me, stabbing deep into my brain. Without opening my eyes, I felt for my game window and turned off the alarm that only I could hear. My eyelids rose to see that the room was still dark. Before I entered the room, I had set an alarm for 2 o'clock, so of course it was dark, but now I felt like I shouldn't have been bothered. I focused on the sounds of the room, and I heard only peaceful slumber from Kismel and Asuna, which made me want to go back into that pleasant warmth too. It was willpower alone that forced my eyes to stay open. Once I had maintained 30 continuous seconds of wakefulness, the temptation of sleep subsided. It occurred to me as I crept along that the dark elf, an alarm that only I could hear, would fall under the category of human up charms. Still, I carefully opened the door and went out into the hallway. I was 50% certain that Kismel at least would detect my movement, but it seems that I had pulled it off. I opened my window again and equipped my long coat and sword. There was no humanoid figures on either side of the curving hallways. No guard was likely to scold me if they spotted me, but just in case, I stayed quiet as I headed to the staircase in the center of the west wing. When the bell rang early in the evening, I had plunged down these stairs, but this time I was slow and deliberate climbing them. As I remember from the beta, the stairs continued past the fourth floor, which was the highest in the castle. Eventually, they ended in a small door. I turned the knob and pushed it open. Fresh, chilly air instantly surrounded me. The doorway led out onto the roof of the castle in the west wing. There was no man-made light here, but the moonlight was coming from the outer aperture of Einkrad, was just enough to keep the dark at bay. Then again, the exterior of the staircase corridor itself was about the only feature of note on the vast roof anyway. In a single-player RPG, you'd expect to find a chest or two on a secluded location like this, but here, there wasn't so much as a pebble to pick up. Unlike the polished castle walls, the surface here was rough and pockmarked. I walked along the exterior that bordered the courtyard. There were parapets barely a third of a meter tall, but they weren't going to prevent anyone from falling. It was a good 20 meters down to the paving stones, so a headfirst fall could prove fatal. I made sure I was alone, just in case, then leaned over to stare into the courtyard at the scenery that was a polar opposite of its daytime setting. Countless little torches cast the huge spirit tree in alternating navy blue and orange, and the dew that hung and dripped from its leaves and the branches shone like liquid fire. Pairs of guards marched slowly around it, like a vision from some fantastical dream. After a moment of entranced viewing, I snapped back to the attention and examined every part of the courtyard I could see. Nothing was amiss. The bells hadn't rung, so that means no one had entered the castle, NPC or player. But I still had to check, to make sure before I allowed myself to step back from the edge. When I turned around, I looked at the exterior of the castle instead. Galley was a castle that had been carved into the walls of the previous extant circular stone hollow. So the outer edges were surrounded by sheer natural cliffs. Even from the roof, it was nearly 10 meters to get to the top, so despite the sort of Eventide agility bonus, I couldn't quite race up the cliff. But since the beta, I'd always wondered what exactly might be found beyond this rock face. I was sure that the castle gates on the south side were impregnable, but until I saw it for myself, I had trouble ruling out intruders coming from atop the cliffs. I needed to make sure the possibility of a forest elf invasion was no more than zero. I pulled my gaze away from the cliff walls and began walking up to the right. Up ahead loomed the three parts gabbled full roof of the castle center building, which was one floor taller than either of its wings. The angle was steep, but not vertical like the cliffs. The peak of the roof reached the edge of the cliff, so my thinking back in the beta was I could just climb that structure instead. But no matter how I tried back then, I would always slipped and fell back down after about 3 meters. However, my stats were better now, and my boots were higher quality, with good grip. I came to a stop about 20 meters from the gabbled roof, envisioned the course I would take, and began to sprint. With about 5 meters to go, I hit max speed. Under the roof was a forbidden 5th floor of the central building, which probably included the Count's private chambers, so there was a possibility I could get myself in major troubles. But that was something to worry about later. A massive jump got me into the middle section of the roof, and from there I began to wall run diagonally up the 70-degree slope. I felt my soles slipping at the 5th step, as they gave way a few centimeters by the 7th, but I managed 2 more steps before jumping again. If I grunted with effort, I might wake up Count Galleon just under the roof, so I had to make sure to do it with silent emphasis, stretching out as far as I could as far as I could reach. My fingertips grasped the lip of the cliff, and I let the mountain boost me, and I scrabbled for all I was worth. I was prepared to be met by an invisible purple barrier set up by the system itself, but it did not happen. I managed to pull myself up the wall and rolled over onto my back, panting for several long moments. What I'd just done didn't, as far as I knew, expend a single calorie of energy from my actual physical body. But when you worked your avatar to its physical limits, there was always a period of heavy breathing afterwards. But in just a matter of seconds, the feeling passed, and I slowly sat up. All that I saw before me was flat. I doubted the designers had cut corners here, but the only thing ahead was rough, flat rock, with hardly any features or change in elevation. I stood up and kicked the ground. It was very tough. At the very least, it seemed like I didn't have to worry about slipping through some polygonal crack or clipping into another dimension. In other words, it could support the weight of hundreds of soldiers. Kismel claimed that the elves couldn't move through the dusty canyon outside of Castle Galley without capes made of leaves from the holy tree. But there was no guarantee that this held true top of this cliff, too. I needed to ascertain if there was another way here aside from the roof of the castle. After a brief survey, I started walking directly north. There wasn't a single monster or even a cactus on top of the flat mountains. So I used the massive pillar supporting the next floor of Einkrad in the far distance as a landmark, utilizing nothing but moonlight for illumination. Asuna liked high places, and I figured she would enjoy the barren terrain, but there was a good reason for not bringing her. Truth be told, I didn't entirely trust the members of Quasac. It was true that if you beat all the many quests so far, you would earn as much XP if you were efficient in farming monsters, and you would get high-spec gear as rewards. With a powerful, ever-present Dark Elf soldier around as a bodyguard, it wasn't unthinkable for the four to reach this castle, even without much of battle experience. But it still didn't answer the question of why they would do this. Their claimed reason for leaving the safe haven was to earn money for food and lodging. In other words, to make their waiting time in the town of beginnings as pleasant as possible. Apparently, they were surprised to learn how strong they were and temporarily hoped they could reach advancing group. But that dream ended after the disaster at the Swamp Kobold Trapper. So that led it to being quest-centric, forming a guild based around making sacks with quests. That all made sense. What bothered me was the timing of their arrival here at the frontier of the player progress. At present, the only people farther ahead than us were the ALS and the DKB, proceeding on the clockwise route around the floor towards its end, with the Bro Squad and Argo and the info broker accompanying them. There was no good intel out yet on the monsters and tricky terrain of this slice on the 6th floor, and even with a powerful NPC accompanying them, the risk of death was greater than 0. If I were in their position, I would stay one floor down from the frontline group at minimum, and only engage in quests when I had plenty of help from Argo's strategy guides. The Elf War campaign quest wasn't some race to be first anyways. So there had to be some other reason for their rush to reach Castle Galley. Perhaps someone had hired them to do something. Perhaps someone who wished to do us harm. In other words, I couldn't rule out the suspicion that Quasac had some connection to Morche's PK gang. There was a 99% chance I was overthinking it, but coming right on the heels of the paralysis attack incident, I swore to never be caught unawares again. If Quasac was connected to the manipulation or manipulated by Morche, they would search for alternate routes into the castle. And the first thing that would come to mind would be the crossing the cliff that formed the back of the half of the castle. As the historical battles of Ichinotane and Itsukushima had shown, the best traditional means of ambush was to come down a cliff. Or maybe I was just being dramatic. I strode across the desolate rock, my eyes careful combing the areas for information. Still, no people or monsters to be seen. I did have a full perimeter lap and encouraged no one. I'd have to give the members of Quasac a silent apology next time I saw them. What? Ow! The next moment, I let out an actual yelp and struggled to pull back my leg I had extended. My balance rocked, and I windmilled my arms, trying to catch the air. There was no ground beneath my extended foot. Blended perfectly in color between the rock and ground, and the background was an abrupt cliff, as sharp and clean as a cut by a knife. The drop was over 30 feet in meters, it looked like. With the help of the air expelled by my lungs, I managed to pull the center of gravity backward and plopped onto my butt. When my heart stopped pounding, I crawled forward and timidly peered over the edge. The cliff was so sheer it practically an overhang and continued all the way to the ground below. No player or forest elf could climb that surface. It was impossible. I backed up, still on all fours, and only stood once I was safe distance from the cliff. I opened my window and checked the map to find that the distance between my present location and the outer aperture of Eincred was not much more than 200 meters. This was the northern tip of the Rocky Mountain. It was nearly 3 in the morning now, but I had to find out how far this cliff went. I took a bottle of water out of my inventory for a quick swig, then walking east. I thought I was keeping a safe distance from the edge, the darkness and pre-dawn night. It was very hard to tell where the line was. I twisted. I wished I had a lantern for light. If any other player were on top of the mountain, they would have certainly seen it. There was no cover at all on this plateau's surface. The trudging continued, with maximum care given to the ground around me. Occasionally I approached the edge and peered over, and never saw any change in angle. I started to wonder if I was just overthinking things with regards of a forest elf ambush or a sinister Quasac angle, until about 15 minutes later when I saw something I absolutely did not expect to see. It was not a protrusion from the rock floor, but a hollow, a descending staircase cut right down into the stone without any structure overhead. Like something from an early RPG, there was a faint flickering coming from the farthest down of the stairs. I stopped 2 seconds before my brain started running again, and then I silently got down to one knee. A little touch on the edge of the stairs told me that, like the castle itself, they were carved straight down into the rock. The chisel mark texture was very similar to the castle's, but I couldn't yet be sure that it's also done by dark elves. If there just so happened to be someone hostile down there, and they were dangerous enough that if I died in a fight, there was no way I could ever apologize to Asuna and Kismel for my foolishness. For both figuratively and literal reasons, of course. Sadly, I knew I ought to avoid the danger for now, and go back to speak with the women. But when I stood up to leave, I sensed an olfactory input that was out of place. It wasn't a nasty smell, just the opposite. In fact, it smelled like spices, onions, and fatty meat cooking. There was nothing else I could compare it to. It smelled like a good old hamburger steak. For 3 seconds, my mind went haywire. My stomach curled up, and saliva flooded my mouth. Only when it threatened to drool out my lips did I come to my senses. There, on my knees, I considered the situation. If what awaited at the bottom of the stairs was some kind of ogre that lured prey with the smell of steak so that it could kill and eat them, then going down there to my death would make a world-class idiot. But, what if there was some kind of chance that this staircase was an invitation from the hamburger steak fairy, who only appeared one time a year? After all, there were cacti that only fruited for 30 minutes out of an entire year. So couldn't this miracle happen as well? I clenched my fist for about 10 seconds and finally came to my decision. Asuna, Kismel, I'm sorry. Even knowing this might be a trap, I believe that I was meant to walk down these stairs. Then I got on my feet and took a step down into the narrow stairway. The opening was a square barely over a half meter to a side. So just from taking these 3 steps down, my stomach hit the ceiling side of the opening. It seemed like the opening to a stairway should be rectangle, I thought, grumbling, and leaned backward so I could essentially slide down the steps. Only when I was about 20 steps down did it finally end into a hallway tall enough for me to stand. And even then, my head nearly touched the ceiling. And I was not particularly tall. This space, too, was narrow enough that it almost impossible for two people to squeeze past each other. So I knew I wasn't going to get attacked by an ogre or a giant in here. There was no light source in the passage, but the red flicker of flame reflected from the curve about 10 meters ahead, and the smell of cooking meat was getting stronger. I stepped lightly and slowly onward. When I reached the right turn, I stuck the corner and peered around for just a moment, pulling my head back. I played back the still image in my mind, like I'd caught it on film, but it was confusing. At the end of a hallway was a room about 3 meters to a side. In the middle was a small table and chair. The right wall was wooden shelves, and the left wall featured a small door. On the far wall was a black cylinder that looked like a heating stove, in front of which stood someone in a black robe who was peering into a frying pan on top. The pan, clearly the source of sizzling sound and tempted smell, but sadly, I couldn't make out the contents. The black-robed figure had its back to me, so I couldn't tell if it was human, elf, or some other demi-human monster like a goblin or orc. At the very least, it was shorter than me, so I couldn't be some man-eating ogre. I peered around the corner again, this time looking long enough that the figure's color cursor came into focus. Surprisingly, the black robe seemed to be made very fine material, like velvet. Unruly curls of gray, almost white hair ran down the back. And on the head, there was a pointed hat of some material as the robe. The cursor floated above was yellow, an NPC. The figure's name? Bohrum, Dark Elven Anecdotist. I couldn't make out how to say their name, and I had no idea what an anecdotist was. But I could definitely tell they were a dark elf, so they weren't going to just attack me out of the blue. Probably. I steeled my nerves and rounded the corner, passing through the hallway and into the room. Good evening, I called out, and the robed dark elf instantly leapt over a third of a meter in the air, its curly hair flying upward, and spun around to face me. Who goes there? Demanded the elf, who was revealed to be, in human terms, an elderly man of at least 80 years, with his skinny, wrinkled face framed by a small pair of rounded spectacles. But of course, there were those characteristic long, pointy elf ears protruding from the curls, so in fact, he could be hundreds of years old. There was a silver beard that hung from his chin nearly down to the floor. Of all the people I'd meet in Aincrad, this was clearly the closest to a classical representation of a wizard, but it also struck me of another reason. I've a slight feeling of déjà vu, like I had met this fellow somewhere before. Perhaps, but I would never forget someone so distinctive. At the very least, the old fellow did not recognize me. His tiny eyes bulged behind the glasses, and his lengthy beard quivered as he shouted, "Boy, you're human, aren't you? How did you get into my secret chamber?" "How? The normal way down the stairs," I said, pointing out the hallway I just walked down. The old man raised a fist. "You fool! That is not an entrance!" "Huh? Then what is it?" "It's my chimney vent. And besides, that is a bald mountain top up there, where even birds do not dare to cross. How did you climb up there?" "Well," I stammered, thinking I would probably be in trouble if I told him the truth. Then again, I was clearly already in trouble with him, so what was the difference? "I climbed up the roof of the central castle building." Now both the man's eyes and his beard mouth hung round open, an expression that lasted for over 3 seconds before he finally emitted a strange burst of noise. "You're telling me that a young human boy, climbed his way up the roof of little Milen's bedchamber?" Apparently, the ka-ka sound was his laughter. He lowered his raised fist and stroked his beard with the other hand. In a softer voice, the old man continued, I see. So the human swordsman who's been helping with the keys collection must be you. I understand now that you are not a thief, but what would bring you to climb the mountain in the dead of night like this?" "Well, I was out for a night stroll, a little night mountain climbing. And I wondered what was at the top of the cliff was like. I wandered around until I found your stairs, your vent, and smelled something nice coming out of it. Ah! The old man screamed, and now it was my turn to jump. He wasn't angry, and his AI hadn't just gone haywire, apparently. He spun back around with tremendous speed and grabbed the handle of the frying pan barehanded. Yow! He transferred the hot pan to the table and blew on his reddened palm. It was all so sudden and alarming that I didn't know what to do until I saw what was sizzling in the middle of the pan. It was an elliptical slab of minced meat, about 15 meters long and seared to a beautiful brown. This was a perfect hamburger steak, the likes of which I'd never seen in Eingrad before. The old man noticed my gaze and ceased blowing on his hand so he could exclaim, "What do you want? It's not for you. This is my one delight a month, and I haven't money left to enjoy. Why, you nearly caused me to char it black." If the food was one of the white fish or chicken dishes that elves so often served at their camp castles, I would have won my saving roll against the temptation and claimed, "I didn't say I wanted to eat it." But this was a hamburger steak. It wasn't my number one favorite dish in the world, but without curry or ramen in Einkrad, the sheer impact of the smell and appearance was nothing short of explosive. The mental image of a knife sinking into it and producing a rush of meat juice from inside the crowded out every corner of thought in my brain. If only there was some way to get this stubborn old man to give up half his steak, even a third. My mind was working as fast as when Morche attacked, when I was struck by a humbled inspiration. I sucked in a sharp breath. The old man used what looked like a wooden spatula, transferred the hamburger steak to a metal plate. As calmly as I possibly, given the circumstances, I asked, "Are you just having that?" "What do you mean?" asked the old man suspiciously, moving the plate away from me. "Oh, the human custom would state that such a delicious meat dish cannot be eaten simply on its own. Only with a side of bread or mixed vegetables can the flavor of the meat truly be appreciated." "Ha!" the old man mocked, waving his free hand. "I grew tired of vegetables over 100 years ago. It's bad enough that the cooks at this castle try to feed me leafy greens and fruit every day, because it'll make you live longer. To put that rubbish on my plate would ruin my precious fricatelle," asked the old man suspiciously, moving the plate away from me. "Oh, the human custom would state that such a delicious meat dish cannot be eaten simply on its own. Only with a side of bread or mixed vegetables can the flavor of the meat truly be appreciated." "Ha!" the old man mocked, waving his free hand. "I grew tired of vegetables over 100 years ago. It's bad enough that the cooks at this castle try to feed me leafy greens and fruit every day, because it'll make you live longer. To put that rubbish on my plate would ruin my precious fricatelle." Fricatelle? I just barely contained my impulse to ask him how that different from a hamburger steak. As long as it looked and tasted like one, it didn't matter what the elves called it. Instead, I waved my hands to call up my game window. The old man clearly hadn't seen much of the human art of scribing, as he reacted with curiosity, but I promptly found what I was looking for and pulled it out of my inventory. Then, what about this? In my fingers, I held a long, elliptical, vivid purple object. It was the last of the sweet potatoes dropped by those half-fish monsters. A regular potato was the best match for this hamburger steak, but I didn't have any, and this would do fine anyway. "What is that?" asked the dark elf elder, who had apparently lived centuries without seeing such a thing. His gray brows drooped in consternation. I rounded the table to show him. "It's a sweet potato you can find on the 4th floor. If you crisp this up in that frying pan, it'll go great with your fricatelle, I bet." If Asuna were here, she'd use ample vocabulary and knack for lyrical expression to convince more than a few stubborn old men to try it out. But it had been my decision not to wake her up first. The man still looked suspicious, and he lifted his spectacles to get a better look. Sweet potato, you say? It has a strange color. The insides will be proper shade. It'll be hot and sweet and creamy, I said, like I was some kind of pitchman for the roasted sweet potato cart. The old man glanced back and forth between my face, the potato, and at last cleared his throat. Ahem, ahem. Well, I suppose I can try it out. If it's as good as you say, I will even give you half of my fricatelle. The potato will go entirely to me, however. That seemed like an abuse of privilege, but I had eaten a number of ichthyoid potatoes, so I should let this slide this time. The old man took the potato, then placed the frying pan back on the stove. Still slick with the juice and fat of meat, in the right corner was a tiny kitchen area, and he went there to slice the sweet potato into slices less than 2 meters wide. Then he dropped the pieces into a pan, which had begun crackling again. Soon a sweet scent filled the air. He peered into the pan, murmuring and exclaiming to himself, and I watched him more than a little consternation. You didn't need the cooking skill to employ primitive methods like thrusting them into an open fire. But it seemed like frying one up in a pan with oil required some amount of expertise. Assuming he had made the steaming hamburger meat out of ingredients items, it appeared that he would have to possess the cooking skill. A minute later, the old man lifted his plate and used a long meat fork to transfer the potatoes one by one. The circles of sweet potato, fried and golden, looked perfectly cooked. How is it? I asked eagerly, forgetting my manners. He glared at me from the corner of his eye. I would tell you if I had eaten a bite yet. Now then. He switched to a normal fork and popped one of the smaller pieces of potato into his mouth. He chewed it for a good long time, swallowed, and groaned. Ow! How is it? I repeated. This time the old fellow looked me straight in the eye and said, It's not bad. Not bad? It seemed like a deal was off. But if so, I felt that now I had the right to eat all the sweet potato he rejected. Until he said, But it would really be terrific with a dab of butter on top. Butter? At first, I was surprised. There's butter in Eincrad? But before my eyes, the man pulled a jar from the top shelf to the right. He placed it heavily on the table and said, Well, don't just stand there like an idiot. Sit down, human boy. Yes, sir. I sat down on the other little stool at the table, and the old man set another metal plate in front of me. You win, boy. Enjoy half the fricatelle, and out of my great magnanimity, these 2 pieces of potato. Before I could say a word, he sliced the jumbo steak in 2 and transferred one half, juices flowing outward, onto my plate. Then he set 2 pieces of sweet potato next to him, dumped the rest onto his own plate, and sat across from me. After that, he pulled the jar closer and stuck a small knife inside, scooping out a heap of creamy white substance that he dropped on a potato slice. I did the same when he passed the jar to me. The metal plates must have been some kind of heat-retaining magic on them. I didn't have the vocabulary to express the devastating sight of rapidly melting butter on top of fried sweet potato right next to a hot, juicy hamburger steak. It was time to turn off my brain and indulge. I lifted my knife in one hand and fork in the other and declared, Let's dig in! Across the table, the old man had cut a large piece of meat loose and lifting it to his mouth. He chewed a few times, popped in a piece of buttered potato, chewed some more, then put on an expression of bliss and moaned, Ah! Instantly, I had another blast of deja vu. I had definitely seen this old man before. It wasn't the last 2 months trapped in Eincrad, but before that. Yet, that was obviously impossible. I didn't know any ancient dark elves in real life. So where? Aha! I shouted, rising out of my seat. It earned me a suspicious look from the man. What is it, boy? Why are you eating? I will. But before that, sir, are you the master of meditation? The old man grunted, raising just one eyebrow and glaring at me. Boy, do you know who I am? Yes. I am the great storyteller of Lysula and the master of the art of meditation. Buchroom, the great sage. Have we met before? We have, in the beta test, I exclaimed in my head. My mouth flapped pointlessly. Over the month-long beta test, the only extra skill we found was meditation. It was a hidden skill that only appeared as a choice when certain conditions were fulfilled, much like the martial arts skill earned through the rock-breaking lesson on the second floor. In fact, Argo the info dealer found martial arts in the beta too, but it was right as the test was ending, so the info didn't get around. Therefore, meditation was the only hidden skill I earned in the beta, but I remember it being finicky, that I didn't have much use for it. The appearance, voice, speaking style of the NPC with the meditation training quest were identical to the steak-cooking old man, only his clothes and long ears were different. The meditation NPC was a human elder, a simple brown tunic. He did not live in a cave near the castle galley, but in a little shack deep in the swampy western area of the 6th floor. His attitude was mostly grumpy. I did not recall him having any special love of hamburger steak. But right before the moment I unlocked my meditation skill, the old man gave me a satisfied smile, and that was absolutely identical to the smile I saw on the dark elf elder as he savored the marriage of steak and buttered sweet potato. Yes, this is Buchroom, who pronounced it Buchroom, was the same figure as the meditation NPC from the beta, just placed within a different setting and context. I had to choose my words carefully now. No, I haven't met you, but I heard the rumors. Aha! So word of my skill and fame has reached even the human towns? He cackled, then stuck another piece of meat in his mouth, looking positively intoxicated. I realized that I needed to eat my portion too, and stuck the knife into the end of the half of the steak on my plate. The seared surface was resilient, but the inside was a light perfectly cooked. The moment I cut through it, the meaty juices oozed out, exuding a spicy scent. The anticipation caused the muscles of the inside of my mouth to tighten, and I lifted my first bite of hamburger steak in over 2 months to my mouth. I gave Austin a silent apology and swore that I would take her here when we got the chance, and opened my mouth wide. Just then, the man said, I should ask, just in case, do you wish to understand the meditative arts? Huh? I stared, open mouth wide. To my surprise, there was a golden question mark over his head, the symbol of a new quest, though Buchroom himself did not see it. Well, I stammered, despite the bite of meat 2 centimeters away from my mouth occupying a majority of my thoughts. If I answered no, I would probably never get another chance to learn the meditation skill. By coincidence, I reached level 20 just 2 days ago, and I had an open skill slot, but the meditation skill was of questionable benefit. You had to assume a funky Zen-like pose for a certain time to receive a continual healing buff and a negative status resistance buff. The shared opinion among beta testers was that there was better skills you could use a valuable skill slot in. It was possible that the effects of the meditation had been buffed for the original official launch, so I could just go ahead and take it, then remove it from the skill slot if it didn't work out. But remembering how long and arduous the martial arts training period was kept me from saying yes. I groaned, hoping to delay my answer so I could at least eat my steak. This was admittedly rather optimistic of me. If you wish to train in it, boy, you must not eat that fricatelle. Huh? Why not? Because that is your training in the arts of the awakening, the special meditation technique. Awakening? I'd never heard that term before. For a moment, I actually forgot about the meat on my fork. A straightforward interpretation of what he meant in advancement of the tree meditation skill. There was a higher ability called awakening, but the meditation NPC on the beta test made no mention of it. I had no idea what it did. Besides, is that something you can't train on unless you already have the art of meditation? I asked. Buhrum took a third bite of his hamburger steak and smiled. A very intuitive youth you are. That is correct, of course. But the conditions to train in the art of awakening involve solving a mystery in the castle library and discovering the existence of this little room. You managed to find me here, although it was through a ceiling vent. You have fulfilled the requirements. My eyes traveled from Buhrum's face to the small door on the left wall. You mean, on the other side of that door is the Library of Castle Galley? Correct. I suppose I could just leave that way then, I thought, trying to avoid facing the challenge before me, the juicy hunk of meat facing on the end of my fork. If I accepted old Buhrum's words at face value, the moment I stuck this hamburger in my mouth, I would no longer be able to acquire this mysterious awakening skill. A rational player would find a single dish of food to be far outweighed by the opportunity to gain the ultra rare skill, which even probably Argo didn't know about yet. But in reality, the allure of meat just centimeters away from my mouth, its appearance, smell, and supposed flavor, it was just too much to resist. This might be my only chance of getting the awakening skill, but I'd also gotten this hamburger steak after some tricky negotiation, and I also might never get to eat it again either. What should I do? What should I do? I clenched my jaw. My fork hand trembled. I was trapped in a tug of war between my brain and my stomach. Across the table, Buhrum was stuffing hot meat and buttered sweet potatoes into his mouth and muttering provocations like, "Ooh, it's so good." I stared at my hamburger steak again and, with all the willpower I possessed, lowered with my right hand. When I'd first started to lift my mouth, I had given a silent promise to the sleeping Asana that I would bring her here one day. That was a promise dependent on having one more opportunity to eat this food. I couldn't make a choice that would permanently take that option off the table. Over 5+ agonizing seconds, I lowered my fork to the plate, breathing heavily, and asked the old man, "Before I train in the art of awakening, can I at least eat the potatoes?" "You may not," he said mercilessly, then scooped the last bits of hamburger steak and buttered sweet potatoes into his mouth. His face went slack, and he moaned, "Oh, it is the best." I waited for him to swallow, before I said, "Old man, I mean, Mr. Buhrum, please teach me the ways of awakening." Abruptly, the question mark symbol floated over his head, turning to exclamation point, indicating that I had accepted the quest. Buhrum pulled the handkerchief out of his robe carefully and wiped his beard before stating imperiously, "Very well, but the training will not be easy. I have lived a very long time, but I can count on the number of people who have passed the trials and mastered awakening on my 2 hands, and none were human." Trials? Not a training period? If it was something like, go to this place, defeat so-and-so and a monster, that would actually be preferable. In fact, I prayed he would say so much. The old man stroked his silver whiskers and placed into place and said cryptically, "It is training and a trial. First, straighten your back." "Huh? Okay." I sat up atop the round stool. This time, his robe produced a short staff, which he used to tap the metal plate before me. There was indeed magic upon the plate, because the cooling heat suddenly began to sizzle again. The scent of fat, spices, and butter wafted up, rich and thick, attempting to reawaken the appetite I was keeping at bay. "What you must do for the next 3 hours is to cast aside your distractions and maintain the tranquility of your heart. If you can do this, boy, then you will stand at the entrance of the path of awakening." Tranquility of my heart? Faced with a baffling trial, I glanced back and forth from the steak-loving old man to the old man's beloved steak. It did sound like an appropriate training method for meditative skill. But how was he supposed to determine whether or not my mind was filled with worldly thoughts and distractions? It wasn't really that hard to avoid moving your body or facial muscles in Aincrad. You can maintain the same avatar posture for hours on end without getting a dead leg or a sore back. Unless you found it truly bizarre position, the hidden fatigue stat rarely ever came into play. I'd never intentionally frozen into place for 3 hours, but I felt like I could do it if need be. Whatever the actual effect on the skill was, the unlocking condition for an advanced extra skill couldn't be easier than martial arts. I had to assume that Bohrum had some means of detecting if I was distracted by something. Or more accurately, that SAO system itself, through Bohrum, had that ability. At that point, I realized something. The nerve gear over my head in the real world was monitoring my brain's electrical activity in close detail all the time. So my brainwaves should be radically different between periods of intense concentration and periods of lazy distraction. And the system, in this Bohrum, could tell the difference that way. If I wanted to earn the awakening skill, I couldn't just hold my avatar still. I need to exhibit true mental concentration for 3 whole hours with a sizzling steak under my nose. The awakening skill was intriguing, to be sure, but as a teenager and more interested in food than the opposite sex, I couldn't imagine myself keeping focus for that long. No, wait. Couldn't I just use the situation to my advantage and focus nothing but the hamburger steak instead? The nerve gear might be cutting-edge technology, but it couldn't actually tell the contents of my thoughts. Think about nothing but a steak for 3 hours straight? I could do that. All right, begin the clock whenever you want. It was after 3 o'clock in the morning. By the time I finished my training, it would be after 6. But if I sprinted, I could get back to the room before Asuna and Kismel woke up. As they're prepared by taking a deep breath, the old man removed a new item from his robe and set it on the table. It was a large hourglass with a wooden frame. It looked essentially the same as a real-world item, except that the sand was contained in the upper chamber and not a single grain was falling. Very good. We will now begin your training in the arts of awakening. Begin! Bohrum tapped the hourglass with his staff, causing the mysterious green sand to silently spill into the lower chamber. I began to stare voraciously at the hamburger steak. It was perpetually heated by the magical plate, but its juiciness hadn't dried up in the least. The meat along the cut shone brilliantly, and the juice flowing out of it mixed with the butter on the sliced potatoes, forming a bewitching marbled puddle on the plate. I wanted to set aside the knife and just stab the whole thing with my fork in one go. I could see myself slicing a roll in half and turning it into a hamburger too. In this case, I would throw on some barbecue sauce and even sweet spicy teriyaki mixed with mayo. Oh, how I wanted it. Ka! Bohrum suddenly screamed, smacking me hard on the shoulder with the short staff. You fool! You've gone and drowned yourself in impure thoughts. Start over. Huh? Could you tell what I was thinking? Do not mock the great sage, Bohrum. Your head was full of crass, greedy desires for fricatele. Oh, okay, you got me, I said, drooping my head. The old man snorted. Will you give up, then? No, I'll keep going. Aha! Very well. He tapped the hourglass again, and the small amount of sand instantly returned to the upper chamber. And now, once again, begin. With the third swing of the staff, I closed my eyes. So Bohrum, as an extension of the SAO system and the nerve gear, had better perception than I counted on. If my plan to think only of hamburger steak wasn't going to work, that made it difficult much higher, but I still had to challenge the task of extreme meditation. I would shut out all sensory information and relax my mind. Fortunately, spacing out was a skill of mine. I let my mind expand in the darkness, thinking nothing, but sleeping. Just becoming empty. Empty. What a wonderful smell, though. And the tempting, sizzling sound. I could use this sound as a morning alarm. Oh, what a smell. How could I go for a Terry Mayo burger right about now? Gah! Whap! He hit my shoulder a bit harder than before. I yelped, Ow! That was exactly the same as last time, boy. opened my eyes to see Bohroom with his staff raised overhead. Your first attempt lasted 10 seconds. Your second attempt was 20. You will never reach 3 straight hours at this rate. Naturally, even with my eyes closed, I could not shut out the sound and smell of steak. If anything, they were even stronger. My hunger was rising too. It was not going to be easy at all to maintain an empty mind. Will you continue? The old man asked, his look dismissive. I grumbled. I knew the moment my hamburger-focused plan failed that my chances were slim, but I hated the idea of giving up now. Upon the fresh consideration of the act of continuing a perfect lack of thought for 3 whole hours was impossibly hard for a video game quest. Perhaps there was some strategy here, a trick that could be employed to make it easier. Bohroom said to cast aside your distractions and maintain the tranquility of your heart. I felt like the key was in the interpretation of tranquility. Keeping your thoughts focused was not tranquil if the content focus was wanting to eat hamburger steak. So if I could fix my mind on a target that would not involve desire or agitation, perhaps I would clear the requirements. Something that I could imagine in detail, but brought peace rather than agitation. The first thing that came to mind was my sword. Its appearance, texture, weight, and already etched into my mind. A sword was a tool of combat, of course, but when I was feeling down or worried, clutching an entire scabbard relaxed me for some strange reason. And when I was ready to stand and fight again, the vitality to do so came flooding upward. All the players trapped in this world who hoped to beat the game felt the same way to a greater or lesser extent. One weapon offered a mental support. But I wasn't sure if I could really maintain the state of tranquility for 3 straight hours. I was just thinking about my sword. The worst that would be if I hung there for an hour or two, then lost my grip. If I had to start over with a 3-hour countdown, I definitely wouldn't be able to get through it. And I could easily imagine Asuna waking up and sending me messages. It had to be something with a stronger attachment than just my sword, and with a more vivid memories attached. For one thing, it had been a while since I had one lonely night against an inn wall or a tree trunk, clutching my sword with both arms to keep the anxiety away. That was because, I gasped. But, however, Bohroom interrupted that. He then taunted, "What do you say? Are you giving up? If you do, you may eat the fricatelle." "No, I'm doing this," I announced, telling myself that this would be the final attempt. "Very good. Now begin!" He tapped the hourglass with the staff, and recharged the green sand began to fall in silence. I closed my eyes, tilted my head just a bit downward, and opened the door to my memories. A silver meteor split the darkness of the screen that was my mind. It wasn't a real meteor. It was the shining light of a sword skill finishing off a dangerous ruins kobold trooper deep in the first floor labyrinth. The basic rapier thrust, linear, executed by a fencer whose name at the time I didn't even know. The first thing I had said to the fencer, who slumped back against the wall after defeating the heavily armored kobold, was a little bit overkill if you ask me. Not the most elegant or poetic of sentiments. When she failed to understand my meaning, I explained the concept of overkilling, and the fencer replied brusquely, "Is there a problem with doing too much damage?" That was how I had first met Asuna, my current ongoing game partner. At the time, Asuna kept her hood on at all time, even when eating. She held her conversation to a minimum, and she never smiled. The first time she showed me anything resembling a smile was, yes, it was when I had beaten the ill-famed kobold lord, boss of the first floor. When I had left the boss chamber first to go activate the second floor teleport gate, she came chasing after me. She said that for the first time, she found something she wanted to do in this world. When I asked her what that was, she just smiled and said it was a secret. That had been December 4th, and today was January 4th. A full month had passed, but that smile was still the same, burned into my memory. Somehow, I'd forgotten about the sound and smell of the hamburger. And moreover, that I was in the midst of a trial for the awakening skill. Instead, I simply relived the route that Asa and I had traveled together since then in minute detail. On the second floor, Asuna's wind fleuret got swept into a weapon upgrading scam, which took a lot of work to unravel. On the third floor, we met Kismel and went on an adventure for the secret key. On the fourth floor, we engaged in water battles, riding a canoe we dubbed the Tilnell. On the fifth floor, we tackled the boss in a tiny group to avoid an all-out war between the ALS and the DKB. Throughout all that time, both Asa and I had found many more occasions to smile than before, it seemed to me. Nothing had changed about this deadly place where the game over was forever, and it was hard to hold much hope for the future when we'd only reached the 6th floor out of 100 total. But nevertheless, the two of us, and sometimes three with Kismel, worked our hardest to survive each day. We nearly died many times. I'd tremble with rage, been devastated by despair, but I kept walking forward through it all. And that had to be Asuna's presence. Thanks to her. I knew that this arrangement, our partnership, was not meant to last forever. We met in extreme circumstances, and we must have sensed something in each other that made us choose to fight together. If we had never gotten involved in SAO, passed each other on the street somewhere, neither Asuna nor I would have stopped or given it a second thought. For now, I didn't know how our temporary partnership was going to end, but that moment would come, whether we broke our duo or not. Either our HP would reach 0 and the nerve gear would fry our brains, or we'd beat the deadly game and be returned to the real world. So as long as we keep fighting at the front line, one of those endings would inevitably come. So I didn't want to give a name to whatever emotion I felt towards the player named Asuna. My role as a former beta tester was to tell her everything I could and keep fighting on her side when that was no longer necessary. Asuna had much, much greater ability and potentially than I did. She could be a true leader, more than the DKB's Lind, and the ALS's Cabal, and even Diavel, the Knight himself. Perhaps the entire meaning of my presence here was that this prison was to ensure Asuna survived until that grand moment. On the other hand, I didn't think of myself as a simple shield or disposable pawn. I had received many things from Asuna in return, every last thing I saw with my eyes closed like this, even her puffed up skulking face and the feeling of an elbow in my ribs was a brilliant entry into my memory and gave me the strength to continue living. Until I became trapped in here. Really, until I met Asuna. I thought that dealing with other people was nothing but a bother. I didn't try to make friends at school. I put up walls between myself, my parents, and sister. And I only sought out trifling substitutes for human interactions online. But the truth was, I'd been built as a person by the parents who raised me for 14 years, the sister who looked up to me despite my disdain, and all the people I'd met in my life. Every human being gave something to others and received something in return. Even Morche and his friends, in the act of trying to kill Asuna and me, were no exception. I didn't know what reason they had going after us. Morche, the dagger user, I suspected was Joe from the ALS, and the man in the black poncho, who was their leader. They might have their own motives, their own sympathies, even their own kind of justice. But when I had decided to use Rage Spike on Morche, that choice of mine was to kill him in order to protect Asuna. Technically, the Sword of Eventide's accuracy bonus kicked in and struck his heart, even knowing that the continual piercing damage would kill Morche within seconds. I did not attempt to pull it loose. I only had 2 hands, and I could not save every last player. Whatever the PK gang's reason for trying to kill Asuna, I would strike back as many times as necessary. I would do anything to protect that gentle smile I saw on the back of my eyelids. Pointed at me. "Very well, that is enough," said a voice, but I could not open my eyes right at that moment. But when I recognized whose voice it was, I recalled the situation. I lifted my downcast face. It didn't seem like 3 hours had passed at all, but the green sand of the hourglass was entirely filling to the bottom of the chamber. "Is the training over?" I asked, my throat hoarse, as I looked at the robed old man across the table. I am willing to lower my requirements and admit that you have passed the hurdle to learn the awakening arts. I suppose for a human boy, there is only one thing more precious than fresh-cooked fricassee." He made it sound as if he could tell exactly what I was thinking, but I stopped myself from asking to confirm this suspicion. It would be beyond uncomfortable to hear him spell out my innermost thought in detail. Later, I realized that when I restated my desire to fight against Morche's gang, my mental state had been drifting further and further away from tranquility. So perhaps the old man did not yell, "Ka!" was a sign that he really was observing my thoughts. But at this point, the rebound of having thought exclusively about one thing for 3 hours meant that my mind was half unresponsive. I watched the dilly golden exclamation point above the old man's head vanished. But as I started to get up from the stool, I realized that the hamburger steak on the metal plate was still hot. Since the training is over, can I... Before I could say, "Eat this," Bohrum quickly yanked the plate back and snapped, "No! If you eat this now, your training will be for naught." What? Really? Extra skills were still a part of the game's system, so once you had it in your skill tree, there shouldn't be any way that eating a steak would cause it to disappear. But after how forcefully the old wise man stated it, I really couldn't argue. I stood up, vowing to myself that sometime in the future I would bring Asuna here and eat that damn hamburger. As I stood, Bohrum sat, sticking his knife into the plate meat he'd just taken from me. "Now, get going. And if you ever want to visit me again, use the proper entrance rather than my ceiling vent." Yeah, I grumbled, looking at the door on the left wall, which I assumed was the proper entrance he was talking about. Going through that door should put me in Castle Galley's library. It was probably a shorter trip back to the room that way, but I still had business to conduct on top of the Rocky Mountain. "Well, I guess I'll come back sometime. Thanks for everything, Bohrum," I said. The sage sent me along with a warm, "And next time, bring the 3 of those sweet potatoes. No, 4. I left the little room, headed up the cramped stairs, vent in the southern hallway, and returned to the flat mountaintop. According to my game window, the time was 6:15 in the morning. The sky through the aperture of Eincrad was violet now, with red rays arriving from the east. I sucked in a deep breath of chilly air, hoping to kickstart my fuzzy mind. It really was an odd experience, like it had been a strange fairy tale, but when I turned back to look, the square entrance was still there, on the rusty red rock face. I shook my head slowly, then switched my window to the skill tab. On the left side, it indicated 5 skill slots. On 4 were occupied by one-handed swords, martial arts, search, and hiding. Their proficiencies in that order were 168, 97, 142, and 117. Martial arts was lowest because I used it only in a complementary way, but hiding was my next lowest because thanks to my partner and the number of times I needed to use it, it was lower than my own. Briefly, I considered removing it from the slot, but I didn't go through with it. Just moments ago, when unlocking the awakening skill, I had reminded myself that my partnership with Asuna wouldn't last forever. When I returned to being a solo player, I was going to need that hiding skill. My first line of business was going to check out what had unlocked the extra skill actually did. Asuna and Kismel would awaken any time. I needed to wrap this up and rush back to the castle, but surely I could just do this first. I sorted my skill list by the unlock date, and as soon as I saw the skill at the top of my list, I let out a yelp. What I found there was not awakening, as Bohrum had mentioned so many times, but the old skill from the beta, meditation, which I hadn't really used all that much. What's going on here? I felt like crawling back down to the vent to ask the great sage to his face, but sadly, I didn't have the time. I craned my neck back and forth, debating whether to slot it or not, and eventually went ahead and dragged the meditation icon to the left. When it dropped in the 5th slot, I gasped again. What? There should have been a number 0 next to the skill to indicate the proficiency, but it was rising with incredible speed. In a blink, it was over 100, then 200, without slowing down, 300, 400, and only at 450 did its pace begin to slow, with the tens and single digits rotating, until it finally came to a stop exactly at 500. After 3 seconds of no thought at all, I rubbed the numbers with my fingertips, just in case. It did not magically vanish, of course. Proficiency 500. I had been using one-handed swords every single day for hours on end over 2 months straight, and it was only at 168, and unlike weapon skills, which rolled a small chance for ticking upward with each attack, the meditation skill only received proficiency when you assumed the Zen pose for close to a minute until the buff kicked in. I couldn't even imagine how much Zen meditation you needed to do to get to a preposterous number like 500. I forced my stiff finger to tap the skill name for a dedicated pop-up. It was a mod screen that I found the source of the strange phenomenon. It oddly simplistic mod tree. There was a small awakening note next to where it said proficiency 500. So awakening wasn't the name of a different skill, it was just a mod for the meditation skill? I muttered, looking forward to the vent. Only in my imagination did old Bohroom actually pop his head out of the opening and yell, "That's right!" A mod, short for skill modifier, was a special effect that applied once a skill's proficiency reached a certain level. There were other terms for this concept in other games, like perk or extension, but they all meant the same thing. It was a major feature, as the decision of which mod to use could have a drastically different effect on how the skill worked for the player. For example, when I reached proficiency 50 with one-handed swords, I chose shortened sword skill cooldown, 1, and at 100, I picked quick change. I hadn't used my 150 choice yet, but I was probably leaning towards an increase of critical hit chance, 1. But one of those critlers who obsessed over landing critical hits would probably use up all 3 mod selections on increased critical hit chance 1, increase critical hit chance 2, and increase critical hit chance 3. In this sense, skill mods could encourage a vastly different playstyles, even among players using the same type of weapon. Pretty much all of the other skills had mod selections at proficiency 52. Martial arts, which classified an extra skill, was no exception. I powered it up right after gaining during a period of collecting upgrade materials, and selected relax equipment conditions, a crucial mod that gave me the ability to activate martial arts skill with an open hand or leg, even when I had a weapon equipped in my dominant hand. But according to the skill tree, there was no mod selection for meditation until you reached proficiency 500. In other words, because I passed Bohroom's trial and earned the awakening mod right off the bat, the game's systems most likely ensured that this was possible by instantly raising my meditation proficiency to 500. It seemed ridiculous, but there was no other interpretation. Wondering what sort of effect that a mod could require that such a thing proficiency would offer, I tapped the awakening label and read, for the explanatory text appeared. Focuses concentration to the extreme and draws out hidden strength. What the hell is this? I shouted, all alone on an empty rock. It said nothing about the actual concrete effect. I figured I would just go ahead and use the skill, but there was no use button. That meant it wasn't an active mod like quick change, but a passive one that conferred its effect just by having it unlocked. The problem was that not only did I not know what the effect was, there wasn't even a new buff icon next to my HP bar that might tell me. All I knew was that now I couldn't take meditation out of my 5th skill slot. It wasn't locked there by the system, of course, but I had a feeling as soon as I took it out, that 500 proficiency would go back to 0, and I would lose the awakening mod too. Perhaps if I sat down to meditate and activated the meditation skill, the effect of the awakening mod would kick into automatically, but I didn't have time to sit around messing with that. Instead, I closed the window, trying to suppress my irritation. It was around the time Asuna might send me a message, but I had to finish the job I'd been doing before I returned to the castle. I glanced around the mountaintop, which was much brighter now, confirmed that there was no other figures or monsters in the vicinity, and started running along the sheer cliff just to the west. Since I didn't have to worry about where I stepped like I had in the middle of the night, I was able to sprint at full speed. After a minute, the ground vanished up ahead of me. I put on the brakes so I could look straight down at the cliff. All I saw were the grand carved castle gates. That meant that Castle Galley was surrounded on all sides by sheer vertical cliffs, and that even Mountain Goat couldn't climb, and it was impossible to get inside except through the gates. It seemed impossible for the Forest Elves to come over the mountains to sneak attack. With that concern ruled out, I exhaled in relief. That hadn't eliminated the possibility that Quasac might be aligned somehow with Morche's gang, but if they could only get in through the front gate, then as long as I heard the bell first, there was no worry about waking up to find an intruder with a knife over my bed. We'd probably see the group before again in the dining hall, so next time we met, I could get them to clear up the issue of why they came to the frontier so early. Just as I stretched and began to ponder how I could get back to the room, a breezy sound effect in its icon alerted me to an incoming message. I hunched over my shoulders and guiltily tapped the icon, bringing up a simple message from my current partner. "Where are you?" A second later, I replied, "Morning walk, be right back." A glance around showed that I was currently atop the mountain, connected to the east side of the Castle Galley's gate, but our guest room was in the west wing, so there was no direct route back. I had to go circle around the cylindrical mountain to go back down the triangular roof in the center of the building and on top of the roofs again. As I pondered this, my eyes traveled down the sheer cliffside again. Atop the thick gate was a walkway with parapets, which a single dark elf was patrolling now. The drops from where I stood to the walkway was about 6 minutes, impossible to scale barehanded, but a jump I could handle with my current stats. Of course, if a sudden gust caught me, I missed my landing, I could plummet to the ground far below to my instant death. Pointless challenges like this were verboten now in the game where death was real, but for some reason, I got the feeling that this was a good test whether or not I could get from the mountains to the gate walkway while I had the chance. I lined myself up with the right for the attempt. When the guard was headed farther in the other direction, I jumped. The walkway was close to 2 meters wide, so outside of an emergency, I didn't think my judgment would be off. I kept my arms wide to maintain the balance and landed smack in the middle of it. I didn't suffer any damage, but I couldn't prevent the sound and the guard heading the other way whirled around. He raced over, long spear ready, so I quickly held up my hand with the sigil ring on it. I wasn't sure that I was going to do anything, but at any rate, the guard lowered the spear and asked suspiciously, "What are you doing up here?" "I'm, on a walk," I said, repeating my excuse to Asana, and said the guard seemed to buy it. "I see. You are free to walk about the castle, but do not impede on official duties. This gate is the key to the Castle Galley's defenses, and we cannot allow the tiniest mouse to sneak in under our noses." I understand, of course," I said, then asked, "Has any foe ever attacked the castle before?" "If by foe you mean the Forest Elves, never. The elves shrivel and weaken when traveling across those dried sands," the guard said, pointing south of the gate. I saw how the canyon, bordered by cliffs much lower than the one I'd been just atop of, continued along for hundreds of meters, with a bridge of stone that crossed the piles of white sands on the canyon floor. A new question suddenly occurred to me. I turned to the guard and asked, "In that case, who lined up those stone platforms? Wouldn't the dark elves who constructed this castle in the distant past have trouble working on the canyon too?" "You are correct," he said, turning around to look at the huge spirit tree that loomed over the inner courtyard of the castle. "Human swordsman, do you know why the spirit tree has been living for centuries upon centuries?" "Because it's sucking up the hot, bubbling water from the earth, right?" "So you have done your homework." The guard noted with satisfaction, his shining black helmet bobbing. He pointed at the spring around the roots of the tree. In the distant past, there was a project to create an aqueduct from the spring that would travel out of this castle so that more trees could be planted. The idea was that if the trees could take root in that dusty canyon, we might be able to venture outside the castle. But just after 100 meters of channel from the castle, the spirit appeared ready to dry up, and the project was hastily cancelled. The stone looked like a pathway, but in matter of fact, it was a remnant of that ancient aqueduct. Oh, I had no idea, I said, noting to myself that though the hamburger steak became a facatelle, they still used real-world distance units. Thank you for teaching me all these things. It is no matter. In return, I ask that you only offer your protection to your knight. Well, of course, I said, leaving his side, descending the stairs on the west side of the walkway, this entrance being properly rectangular, thankfully, and proceeded to the courtyard, where I raced for the door on the west wing. I dashed up the nearest staircase and flew into the third-floor guest room, where I met gazes with two women sitting on the sofa. The moment I smelled the fragrant scent of tea wafting up from the cups on the table, my stomach grumbled, a complaint over the lack of hamburger steak in it. But now was not the time for that. Hey, good morning, Asana, Kismel, I said with an utterly natural and pleasant smile. The fencer glared up at me. In a tone of voice notably cooler than usual, she asked, "Did you enjoy your morning walk?" It was cold, and I got hungry. I'm not surprised. It's January. I could tell she was quite displeased. Fortunately for me, the dark elf knight threw me a bone. Don't be so cross, Asana. It is the nature of boys his age to simply get up and wander off. Boy seemed like a mean word to use, but when I considered that I turned 14 only 2 months earlier, I might as well be a baby to the long-lived elves, and from that perspective, my partner didn't seem that different in age, still a child herself. But she turned to Kismel with the smuggest of look I'd ever seen and said, "If he was going for a walk, he could have at least left a note. He's not a child." Gosh, I'm really sorry about this, I said, bowing with my hands pressed together. At last, Asana's expression softened. She turned to me and looked me square in the face this time. When I woke up and realized you weren't in the room, I was worried. You haven't forgotten that we're outside the safe zone, right? The fact that she used the video game turned safe zone in front of Kismel and didn't even realize it. She told me that her concern was real. I put on a serious look and told her the truth, if only half of it. Sorry, but I was really curious about something, so I went inspecting the mountains around the castle. Oh? Kismel murmured, more interested in what I had to say than the safe zone term. She lowered her teacup to the table. You climbed the outer ring of the castle? How? I raced the roof here up to the Lord's bedroom. Kismel's reaction was much the same as both rooms. Her eyes bulged briefly, then she chuckled in a way that I rarely ever seen from her. I see. Then you are a more mischievous lad than I took you for, Kirito. Even till now, the tomboy never carried out such a bold plan, even if she had the thought of it. No, really, it wasn't that special. I don't think she was complimenting you, Asana snapped. My eyes swiveled back to Kismel, who was composing herself after all the chuckles. And what were you looking for the outer ring? I wasn't looking for anything specifically. I decided that I wasn't going to tell them what I did find, the storyteller's secret hideout, and stuck to my original mission. I was just wondering if the forest elves might climb over that mountain to attack the castle. I see. I had never considered that possibility. Well, it ended up being wasted effort. The mountain that had no human could ever climb it, so I think we could rest easy on that knowledge today, I announced. Asuna blinked several times. Kirito, you went up there to inspect the mountains just for today's sake? Well, I guess that's true. I see, she murmured, then smiled. Well, in that case, I forgive your unapproved leave of absence. Now, let's go get some breakfast. Yes, I agree. And you are the one deciding what we shall do today, Asuna? Kismel confirmed, getting to her feet. Asuna patted her on the back. Of course, I look forward to it. All I could do was hope. I followed them out of the room that we weren't going to spend the day doing a full tour of various baths. We enjoyed a healthy and but fulfilling breakfast of green salad made with basil-like plants from the courtyard, an omelet mixed with crushed nuts, a yogurty substance with a sliced fruit inside, and a crisp, thin toast. But Asana did not unveil her schedule for the day as we ate. She really wanted to draw out the suspense until right before we left. After the meal, we had tea and went back and forth about ideas. I bet we're doing such and such over at blah 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 blah. Bzz, wrong again. Until eventually, the four members of Quasac appeared in the dining hall. They were proddingly sleeping along. When they noticed us and shuffled over, I was inwardly alarmed. Unlike last night, this time we had Kismel at the table. But I wouldn't be unnatural to get up and leave, and we couldn't simply shoo them away. As I waited, praying that they wouldn't start talking about in-game systems, Gindo's group sat down at the table right next to us. After a few moments, I said a good morning and introduced Kismel as the Dark Elf Knight adventuring with us. Fortunately, Temu, who seemed the most likely to flip out over this situation, was half asleep at the moment, and the introductions went by without extra comment. Kismel had told us about the decoys and fakes keys last night, so I thought we'd be safe if the topic of today's quest came into conversation. But just in case, I decided to bring up a different topic to start things off. To kill two birds off with one stone, I asked Quasac why they came to the front-line region so suddenly, when there was very little information surrounding it at this point. Hyson's answer didn't sound fishy in the least, but it stunned Asuna and me nonetheless. Well, the truth is, we expected to take another 3 days or so on Stachen's series of quests, but we had to call that off for an unexpected reason. What happened? Wait, you guys don't know? The central figure of the quest, Lord Silent, just up and vanished. It was in the night of the 1st, I think. Ask any servant at the mansion, and none know where he went, and there's no hint about it in the quest log. We just didn't know what else to do but move on.